Thank you to Likewise for sponsoring this video. Reading is one of my favorite ways to relax, but when I am the most stressed, I usually want to go back and reread my old familiar favorites. I still enjoy my favorite comfort reads, but I do want to branch out as well. Just using search engines to look for similar titles tends to just produce the same handful of suggestions over and over again. Likewise is a 100% free app that helps solve this problem, not only with book suggestions, but also recommendations for podcasts, movies, and TV shows. The app is powered by a combination of smart technology and recommendations from real people to help you find the best recommendations possible. Likewise gives you daily suggestion cards based on books and genres you like, so you never run out of new recommendations. You can explore groups for specific interests by having conversations with other members and checking out their lists of recommendations. If there is something specific you are looking for, you can ask the Likewise community for their help. Likewise also has a lists feature, which allows you to organize all of the content it helps you discover, so you never forget a title you want to check out. Since I read so much true crime content when I'm doing research for this channel, I generally don't read it in my free time, but I did list true crime as a genre I like when I signed up for Likewise, and I've explored some of the true crime lists and groups on the app. I was very interested to discover Slonim Woods 9, a memoir by Daniel Barban Levin, which gives a first-hand account of the creation of the cult Larry Ray is alleged to have started out of his daughter's dorm room at Sarah Lawrence College. This is a case that I have been following for a long time. Larry Ray is currently on trial, and I may cover the case once the court proceedings are finished, so this book may be a source in a future video. You can click the link in the description to download Likewise. You can also follow me on the app at Heavy Case Files. The hobbies that Sherry Black enjoyed in her youth helped her build a happy life as an adult. Her parents owned a bowling alley, which helped Sherry become a talented bowler. She was a member of a number of competitive bowling leagues and traveled throughout the United States to compete. It was through one of these bowling leagues that she met the man who would become her husband, Earl Black. The couple married in April of 1965, and Sherry was soon able to turn their shared love of the outdoors and of animals into a career, working as a docent at the Hogle Zoo in Salt Lake City, Utah. Sherry and Earl had 2 children, Heidi and Jason. Jason tragically passed away in 1989 at the age of 18. Heidi would go on to marry a man named Greg Miller and had 6 children, who were all adored by Sherry and Earl. Heidi raised her children in a home next door to her parents so that Sherry and Earl could be an active part of their grandchildren's daily lives. The fall of 2010 was a time full of changes for Sherry and her family. Sherry and Earl had 1 great-granddaughter, and their first great-grandson was due to be born in the spring. Their oldest grandson had just recently arrived in Chile, where he would be serving as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Sherry and Earl's daughter Heidi had married into a prominent Utah family who owned numerous car dealerships as well as the Utah Jazz NBA team. While the Blacks were much more low profile, they worked hard for what money they had, and they were eventually able to turn their interests into business ventures. Sherry had a lifelong love of reading and was able to build a business selling books. Earl worked making custom knives and pool tables. The growing space they needed for their businesses led to Sherry and Earl building a store connected to their home of almost 40 years, which was tucked back from a busy 8-lane highway in South Salt Lake, Utah. They worked alongside each other in the store they named B&W Billiards and Books. November 30th, 2010 started out as a normal day for Earl Black. However, his day and the rest of his life abruptly went off track shortly before 2 o'clock that afternoon when he arrived at the store he shared with his wife. When he went inside, he discovered Sherry's body. A pair of scissors was lodged in her chest, and there were lacerations on her head and her neck. She was partially naked, and later examination of her body would find signs that she had been sexually assaulted after she was killed. In addition to being stabbed, she had also been beaten. A distraught Earl called 911, and authorities were soon on the scene. Earl was taken to the police station, where he met with authorities for the rest of the day and most of the evening. The investigation into Sherry's death was stymied early on because no one could identify a motive for the murder. When police canvassed the neighborhood, everyone described Sherry as the ideal neighbor. She was quiet but very friendly, and never caused any problems in the neighborhood. There were no signs of forced entry at the scene. Robbery did not appear to be the motive for the murder because cash was still in the register, but there was no way of knowing if any valuable books had been taken from the store. While there was a digital record of some of the books Sherry owned because she was offering them for sale on Amazon, there were no such records for the books she planned to sell directly. Sherry kept no records of the books she had in her collection, instead keeping her inventory in her head, which was a common enough practice, according to some of her acquaintances in the used book business. Sherry had been selling books for approximately a decade at the time of her death. A large part of her business involved sourcing used books at thrift stores and estate sales. Thanks to her lifelong love of reading, she had a talent for being able to discern which books were valuable and which ones were not worth reselling. She would sell used children's books and novels by listing them on Amazon.com. Most of the items Sherry sold online were not particularly valuable, with a notable exception being a hardcover edition of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which she had listed for sale on Amazon for just over $2,700 at the time of her death. Sherry was also involved in the world of selling vintage books and texts connected to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, combining her love of books with her faith. Early LDS literature is highly prized amongst collectors, and some rare books sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. While Sherry had been involved in some higher ticket sales, she generally sold collectible church-related texts that were valued at between $100 and $300. Since she had no inventory records for this part of her collection, it was theoretically possible that her killer had stolen a valuable book. Sherry's bookstore did not run on a traditional retail model. She had almost no customers walk in off the street, and almost exclusively bought and sold books at the shop by appointment. This allowed her to run personal errands or search for new books to sell during normal business hours. Sherry had an impeccable reputation amongst other booksellers and dealers of LDS literature, as well as with her customers. She was known for her integrity, and her customers would come back to sell to her again and again because she was always fair in her transactions. She cared about books and protecting the history they contained, but also about the people who trusted her enough to be her customers. Sherry was unknowingly involved in one criminal transaction, something she was horrified to learn of after the fact. In February of 2009, she paid a 20-year-old named Lauren Nielsen $20,000 for 14 rare books connected to the early history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, including a second edition of the Book of Mormon. Nielsen had sold books to her before and had later purchased some of them back from her. Nielsen's father was a church president in a polygamous offshoot church. In March of 2009, he noticed that several of the books in his collection of rare LDS texts were missing. He reviewed his security footage and saw his son Lauren removing the books from his personal library on February 20th. Lauren had been at the home, which also served as a church meeting place, for a funeral that day. The elder Nielsen confronted his son about the books, and Lauren admitted to taking them and selling them at B&W Billiards and Books. He then threatened his father, telling him that he would not be happy with the chain of events that would unfold if he contacted the police. Lauren claimed this was because he was a member of a local gang. Lauren's father still called the police, who in turn contacted Sherry Black. She was very upset to learn that she had purchased stolen property. She told the police the approximate value of the books she had purchased from Lauren was $45,000, a figure confirmed by another book dealer. Sherry was fully cooperative with police when she learned about the theft. She had only sold one of the books, a first edition of the French version of the Book of Mormon, to another book dealer for $10,000. She returned the rest of the stolen books as soon as she was notified that they were stolen. Nielsen pled guilty to theft and theft by deception in April of 2009 and sentenced to 90 days in jail. This led to speculation that he may have killed Sherry in retaliation for her cooperation in the investigation into his theft. Nielsen was booked into the Salt Lake County Jail for violating his parole shortly after Sherry's murder, but police would not confirm if he was being investigated in connection with the crime. Sherry's killer had left behind his blood, palm print, and fingerprints at the crime scene. Police believed he had cut his hand when he was in the process of stabbing Sherry, resulting in his blood being found at the scene. Nielsen's DNA and fingerprints were not a match to this evidence, eliminating him as a suspect. Police had one other piece of evidence left behind at the scene, an Armani Exchange belt. The belt, which may have been a knockoff, did not belong to anyone in the Black family. Its size indicated it would fit someone with a 36 to 38-inch waist. There was a sticker on the back of the buckle, printed with the number 323. Authorities hoped that this number was an inventory or thrift store number, but could never track it down. Sherry's husband Earl was devastated by her death. He never slept in the home he had shared with Sherry for nearly 4 decades again after her murder, and he began missing the family events that had been so central to his life with Sherry. Sherry's grandchildren mourned the fact that their children would not grow up with Sherry as the important and involved figure she had been in their lives. While they struggled with their grief, the Black family also did what they could to bring Sherry's killer to justice and to preserve her memory. They established the Sherry Black Foundation to educate police departments about emerging forensic techniques. They maintained a website with information about the case and regularly put up billboards asking for tips. The reward they offered for information in the case eventually grew to $250,000. While police had the killer's DNA, they could not find a match to it in the FBI's national database. As years passed with no suspect identified in the case, they eventually turned to the novel DNA techniques advocated for by the Black family. On the 7th anniversary of Sherry's murder, the South Salt Lake Police Department held a press conference at which they released composite images of what the man responsible for Sherry's murder may look like at different ages. The images were generated by Parabon Nanolabs using their DNA phenotyping technology, which uses DNA profiles to identify certain features that the contributor of that DNA may have. This was the first time the technology was used in a case in Utah. The effort did result in numerous tips being called in, but did not lead to Sherry's killer being identified. Just a few years later, investigators turned to genetic genealogy to help them identify a suspect in Sherry's case. They were able to narrow down their suspect pool to a single family. They then contacted one member of this family, who agreed to meet with investigators and provide details about their family tree. This effort led to the identification of a potential suspect. He was then placed under surveillance and followed to a public place, where police surreptitiously collected a sample of his DNA from a discarded item. The DNA was tested and found to be a match to the DNA found at Sherry's crime scene. On October 7, 2020, a direct DNA sample was collected from the suspect and submitted to the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services. The following day, they confirmed that it was this man's DNA found at the crime scene. On October 10, 2020, just weeks before the 10th anniversary of Sherry's murder, this individual was arrested and charged with the crime. He was publicly identified as 29-year-old Adam Durborough of Orem, Utah. Following his arrest, and after he was advised of his rights, Durborough confessed to Sherry's murder. He further stated that he had followed the case online and in the local media, and had been aware that the DNA evidence had been recovered at the scene. Durborough's fingerprints and palm print would later be matched to those from the crime scene. At the time of the murder, Durborough had been just 19 years old and living less than a mile away from Sherry's home and store, at the home of his biological mother. Durborough's criminal record stretches back to his teenage years. In 2006, when he was just 14 years old, he was convicted of attempted rape and aggravated assault in Davis County Juvenile Court. It is unclear if Durborough's DNA was collected after this conviction, or if it was expunged from the database when he reached the age of majority. For either reason, it was not in the offender database when the samples from Sherry Black's case were run through the system in 2010. Durborough was again convicted of a crime as a juvenile in 2008 at the age of 16 in Iron County. This conviction was for aggravated assault with weapon or force. Durborough ended up at a juvenile facility in Salt Lake County, where he participated in a program which allowed him to complete his junior and senior years of high school while in the care of the juvenile justice system. On September 16, 2010, Durborough shoplifted 2 CDs from a Shopko store in West Valley City. He pled guilty to a misdemeanor theft charge on October 27th. He was sentenced to 60 days in jail, but the judge suspended the sentence, and Durborough was given probation. Just over a month later, Sherry Black would be killed. While he was now a legal adult, Durborough was still in the custody of the Utah Division of Juvenile Justice Services, and following his shoplifting conviction, he was placed in a foster home under the jurisdiction of Pioneer Youth and Adult Community Services. It was while he was in one of these homes that he committed his last known criminal act. In January of 2011, he stole watches from a jewelry box in his foster home. He later told police he had taken the watches because he had caught 2 men he worked with smoking marijuana and dealing pills. They told him that he would be fired if he could not prove that he was not going to report them, so he took the watches to give to them as collateral so that he could keep his job. The watches were recovered, and the man Durborough had given them to was convicted of misdemeanor theft. Durborough was sentenced to 6 months in jail, and he began serving that sentence at the end of March of 2011. Durborough's only run-in with the law after 2011 was an infraction for failing to have insurance, which was ultimately dismissed. Durborough's DNA was not entered into the criminal database after either of his theft convictions because he pled guilty to a Class B misdemeanor in each case. In the state of Utah, only individuals convicted of felonies and Class A misdemeanors are required to submit samples of their DNA. Durborough formally pled guilty to aggravated murder in 3rd District Court on October 4, 2021. His sentencing hearing was then held on February 23, 2022. At that hearing, Durborough's defense team asked the judge to sentence him to 25 years to life in prison, which would leave open the possibility of him one day being released on parole. They argued that Durborough had cooperated by pleading guilty. They also argued that the murder had occurred because of the anger issues Durborough had as a result of his difficult childhood, during which he endured things which they said no child should go through. This was presumably in reference to Durborough's adoptive father, Joseph Durborough, who was arrested in 2002 for child pornography charges related to his child modeling photography business. He would serve time in both federal prison and the Utah State Prison after being convicted of charges of child pornography and sexually abusing children. Adam Durborough's lawyers argued that while this in no way excused his actions, it should be taken into account when he was sentenced. According to Sherry's family, she would have felt sympathy for Durborough in his circumstances had he made different choices. She helped anyone she could, any way she could. Sherry's oldest grandchild, Courtney Hawks, told the court, "There's the real irony of all of this. She would have been an advocate for this perpetrator if only he'd chosen a different path. Instead, he preyed upon her. He brutally took out all his anger and frustration and rage on her like she was nothing, and she was not nothing." Numerous members of Sherry's family addressed the court during the hearing, providing stories of Sherry's life and how difficult the past 11 years had been without her. They requested that Durborough be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They had worried about him being free for the 10 years after the murder and prior to his arrest, and could not move on if they knew he could be free to hurt someone else in the future. Before sentencing Durborough, 3rd District Judge Randall Scanchi stated that he felt sorrow at both the loss of Sherry's life and the impact it had on her loving family, as well as the fact that Durborough had no such support system. While he believed Durborough was sorry for what he had done, he also believed that the crime was egregious and spontaneous. He sentenced Durborough to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Sherry's family issued a public statement following Durborough's sentencing. While this sentence delivers a sense of justice, no punishment imposed can heal the pain or fill the void created by Durborough when he chose to take the life of our beloved Sherry. The statement said in part, "Although he took her life, he could not take her soul, which lives on and is part of the love, beauty, kindness, and talents that her husband, daughter, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren will carry forward. Her legacy is a gift to future generations. The life she led and the influence she had can never be taken away."